Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for today's webinar with Rachael Cristine Woody. My name is Bradley, and I will be your moderator for this episode titled How to Create a Value-Informed Budget. Before we start, I would like to provide some information about our company and introduce today's presenter. Lucidea is a software developing company specialized in museum and archival collections management solutions, as well as knowledge management and library automation systems. Our brands include Sydney, Presto, Argus, Archivera, Eloquent, and Quadrastar. Now I would like to introduce today's presenter, Rachael Cristine Woody. Rachael is the owner of Relicura and provides services to museums, libraries, and archives. She specializes in museum collections management systems, digitization technology, digital project management, and digital usership. During the course of her career, she has successfully launched multiple digital projects that include advanced digitization technology, collaborative portals, and the migration of collection information into collections management systems. She's also a popular guest author for Lucidea's Think Clearly blog, and she's provided us with many great webinars that are listed on our website. So please feel free to check those out after today's session. Take it away, Rachael.
Well, thank you so much, Bradley. Thank you to Lucidea for having us, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We're going to cover value-informed budgets, and especially as we're in budget season, or even as if your budget season was a little later, to help prepare for. And we're going to cover how a museum communicates its values in a traditional sense, so that we can then explore museum budget areas to evaluate with that value scope in mind. We'll have a review of applying diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion, DEAI initiatives to the museum budget as part of that value-informed piece. And then we'll get into some of the specifics for information that you can gather to help inform the museum budget, and importantly, how you can influence the museum budget, especially if you're not necessarily a decision maker or if you're not necessarily in the room when the budget is being discussed. So we've got some strategies and advice no matter where you are within the budget planning process. So how are our values communicated, especially as a museum, as a nonprofit organization for the majority of museums? And for the traditional value communication, we are familiar with the mission statement, where the museum is telling its audience and stakeholders what its job is, and therefore what it values. Now we are, in the last few decades, also included the implementation of strategic plans that, depending on your museum, can last from a couple of years to 5 years. And those strategic plans usually have a few different areas of focus or areas that they prioritize that indicate what it is that we are valuing and prioritizing for that particular season of years, and how those, of course, align to the museum's mission. So it's a cyclical, what is the mission, what are we valuing, and therefore in our strategic plan, what are the few different areas we're focusing on to help emphasize and invest in those areas of value. We then have the less direct paths of communicating the museum values, and one of the main ones is museum operating budget. It is literally the assessment of where are we putting our dollars, and where we put those dollars, whether we think it is intentional or not, those dollars being allocated is what we value. So what we value is what gets our dollars, and other items that we say we may value, if they are not getting part of our budget, that's usually an indication that we're not valuing those high enough to be competitive with what we are currently funding. We also have, in addition to that annual budget, usually there's a museum slush fund allocation, typically for organizations, that is getting it to the end of the fiscal year for your organization. There may be money across departments that was allocated but not yet spent. And so for some organizations, there's a slush fund where different departments can apply and ask for some of that additional money for finishing projects, or perhaps being able to prioritize a project that wasn't able to be prioritized for the annual budget. And then museum development opportunities or priorities. So development in the sense of fundraising, donor cultivation, grant application writing. Depending on your museum, Typically, the grant applications or different asks that go out are based on what the museum priorities are. They're informed by the strategic plan, and they're typically informed by what the priorities and values are of what's happening at the museum for both a program and project level. So, if the values that aren't getting funded by the annual budget and they weren't competitive enough for the slush fund, there's this third aspect or spoke in the wheel to pursue, which is trying to cultivate development opportunities for these valued projects or valued programs that otherwise have not received funding. As you look at all of those, taking a review of the discrepancies. So as you're looking at the museum mission statement and the strategic plan, what from those are you getting in terms of priorities? What are some of the priority projects and programs that fall under each of the strategic plan areas of focus, for example, and reviewing those next to the annual budget or any of the funds that you're looking at and what the allocation is. So are we seeing that what we are saying we value in our strategic areas of focus, is it matching up with where we are actually putting our money? And not just that, is there a balance? So while we may be funding all of the things we say we prioritize, there may be some areas that are getting a larger portion of funding than what would actually be happening if there was a balance of priority. For example, exhibitions has typically been a fairly well funded, at least in context of the other areas, area of our budget. It's the one program that typically has the money that it needs because exhibition is what, at least pre-COVID, got a lot of visitor attention, funding, granting agency attention. But now, as we're shifting practice, now that we've been through the pandemic together, prioritizing the development of digital programs and all of the aspects that go into digital, like equipment, a collections management system, additional staff in this area, there may be funding going towards the digital program area, but if we were to really balance these as equally important, is the funding demonstrating that equal balance in allocation? So budget versus the priority incongruity. For many of us, and especially for museums that are understaffed and there's always so much more to do than we have time for, this is also very true for our leadership. And if they are not taking the time for some intentional review or an active review of what it is they're funding versus what it is that they're prioritizing, they may need some help and encouragement from you. And the first part of this is us doing that review and then assessing and pointing out where there are unbalances or the incongruity of what we say we value versus what we're actually funding. So with the review of the museum mission statement and strategic plan, with that review of the annual budget, taking a look at triggering events and whether or not decisions were made differently. So for example, the pandemic was definitely a triggering event and a fairly long-term event. Did your museum see that shift or a rebalancing of prioritization and funding going into digital programs to a level that it would for physical exhibits, for the example we've been using? So taking a look at that and then also looking at the different triggering events, whether it's global experience or perhaps local community driven priorities, maybe something has happened in your community that has provided an opportunity or a challenge for your museum to meet. So thinking about those triggering events in the context of your museum and how, whether or not the museum priorities have changed and if the budget has changed with it. If it has, great. If it hasn't, which is probably more typical, then we've got some work to do. So some questions to think about as we're going through this process. How are museum budget allocation decisions made? This is especially important if you're new to the process or you're not in the process quite yet. Even if you're not at the table, understanding how these decisions are made is so incredibly helpful to how we perform our jobs and how we ask for the resources that we need. So if you're not sure, definitely seek out information as to how the decisions are made. Is there a multi-stage evaluation process, and does that include stakeholders outside of executive leadership? For the most part, with the budget, it tends to stereotypically have a very boring effect. Usually, unless somebody is incredibly interested in budget allocation or unless you're in incredible need for resources, paying attention to the budget and the budget decisions being made year upon year can be difficult for us who are not part of that decision making. And if executive leadership aren't including people outside who are the actual stakeholders, which includes you, then it can be difficult to actually make an accurate and informed decision as an executive leader about the budget. So if there's not this invitation in place, if there's not this regular evaluation that brings in outside stakeholders, then now is definitely the time to start advocating for that, or at least planting the idea. And then, is there an evaluative framework in place that centers what the museum values at the forefront of the decision-making criteria? So as those decision makers meet, as they're going through budget evaluation and then the subsequent allocation, how are they centering the museum's values, the museum's priorities as part of that decision-making metric to, one, determine whether or not something is getting funding, and then if it is getting funding, how much of the total operating funding is it getting, and does that actually make sense for the rest of your priorities? So this is a great way to point out in a neutral fashion that some areas of the budget may be getting an unbalanced sized portion of the funding because there's not been an evaluative process where we're taking a look at priorities, which rank more than the other, and where do they rank equally? And then does the funding follow suit? For budget areas to evaluate, there are a few different categories or departments depending on how your museum is organized in like a org chart sense, and whether or not that org chart translates into your budget. For the most part, that is how most museum budgets are formulated, based on like the concept of the department first or a program first, and then the projects and annual activities that take place. For many of us, there will be some sort of front end. So that's going to be all admission, retail, security type costs. There's going to be the executive branch with the leadership and administration in that area. So a lot of personnel cost. There's exhibitions, which have design and construction, but of course also have personnel. The collections management side, so the registrars, archivists, digital asset managers, the artifact handlers. So heavy personnel costs in there, and usually software costs. We have conservation, which will be supply and either outside expertise or in-house personnel. Curatorial with the personnel research side and perhaps some funding set aside to facilitate external research. And then the development piece of that. So personnel that are dedicated towards bringing in additional funding through the various fundraising, grant writing, donor cultivation type events. In terms of breaking them down into meaningful areas for evaluation, yes, we could do it departmentally, but I also encourage you to take a look at the actual outside of department categories. So as I was walking through each of those departments, what were some of the cost categories that you heard? For example, I mentioned personnel. For pretty much all of the different departments that we went through, there's going to be personnel cost. We're then going to think about collection, exhibition, conservation, supplies. There's going to be supplies needed for all of those. Very different supplies, but still supplies. We're going to need equipment for a vast majority of the departments. Some are as simple as just like needing computers. Others are quite extensive. For example, if you are starting and maintaining a digitization program. We're going to have office supplies, which is usually a fairly minimal cost, but still a cost center. And then the actual programs that we are facilitating. So regardless of the department the program may live under, these programs are what we are investing in and are the ones that are typically conveying our value. So what are we valuing? What programs are we putting together? What programs are we funding? So you'll see that these pretty much transcend any sort of department specific, like top down look, and instead are looking at the resources that are needed. We need people as resources. We need supplies as resources. We need specific equipment as resources. And what sort of funding are we allocating to those resources so that we can meet our priorities? When thinking about each of these budget areas and going through an evaluation piece, whether you're part of executive leadership or not, we want to think about for staff, what are the quantity of staff? What are their current capacities? For many museums, a lot of the staff are over capacity or have reached the capacity limit, and therefore an increase in the quantity of staff needs to happen, or a decrease in the amount of what we are asking staff to do needs to happen. And we need to equal that to current workload and perhaps projection of future workload. So we may only have the current workload answer. And unfortunately, for many museums, for staff, there needs to be a rebalancing, especially when it comes to capacity, and especially if staffing can't be increased or temporary contractors to help with that capacity issue. When thinking about a deep dive into the programs area, we want to think about each of the programs as they are within a department, but there can also be standalone programs. One example in particular is any sort of diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion programs. Those tend to be newer programs, but they also are programs that transcend any one department. They should be systemic throughout the DNA of the actual museum operations and the activities that they do. So in the case of DEAI, it makes sense that they, as a program, are not within or under any one department, and in fact are viewed as a standalone program. When we think about why making the argument or having the advocacy for asking why should we redo the budget, we want to think about what has changed since any sort of meaningful updates to the budget has taken place. For so many museums, if it's been longer than a decade, there's going to have been a drastic change in how museums use technology, or at least the opportunity for museums to use technology. So anytime there's innovation in the tools that we have, we want to make sure that we're updating our budget to reflect the access and need to these tools. We want to also think about changing audience engagement and expectations. As we navigate through our internet life, we have developed different expectations for how a specific website will operate. All of the websites or different software programs that we interact with will have similar iconography or similar behaviors that we can expect when we are interacting with it. And the same is true for our audience. As we mature in how we are using, especially online programs, and our expectations for how well those online programs work, we need to make sure we're investing in those areas as a museum to meet those expectations so that our audience and their engagement level doesn't atrophy, which of course will necessitate an investment of budget in these areas so that we can continue to develop and meet our audience expectations, whether it's physically and in person or digitally and with a virtual visit. Also, we want to make sure that we are checking in with the audience demographics and needs, depending on who our community is, depending on the overall health of our community ecosystem, may necessitate different resources that are needed in the more immediate term versus long term. For example, if there's a higher need for access to free Wi-Fi for educational initiatives, perhaps there is specific to different cultural communities, different challenges or opportunities that they are facing that the museum could help provide support or relief for. So making sure that we are in tune with our community ecosystem and how the museum is responding in also a budgetary sense so that there is investment so that the museum can respond appropriately to its community's needs. We do want to think about global disasters. We are increasingly impacted with different events that happen around the world. thanks to being so well connected, the joys and the challenges that comes with that. We've recently experienced the global pandemic together. We are increasingly experiencing environmental and natural disasters and the increase in frequency due to climate change. And so the more we are experiencing those, the more we need to make sure that our budget is adaptive and responsive to those emergency and disaster needs. And as those happen to your community, the different flavors and shapes that those come in should help inform your budget for your museum and how it can and wants to react, not just for the sake of the collections, security, but also for the sake of helping your community. We need to look at changing or realized values. There's been some good critical work that's been happening within our field, both for art and culture as well as history, and how we are bringing collections into different communities, how we're inviting communities into our collections. And these strategies necessitated change in our programs, change in how we behaved, and they should also necessitate a change in your budget, what you're funding and how you're funding it. And then finally, rapidly changing resources. So all of our museums are comprised of different financial streams. The more diverse financial streams you have, typically the better, the little bit more resilient you will be to any sort of economic or otherwise impacting economic disaster. And as our resources change or react to different events that can occur with our communities or globally, we need to make sure that our budget has the ability to adapt to these changes in resources. Because if we are not paying attention to the changes in our resources, then we are going to be caught surprised and not in a good way in terms of being prepared financially and building that financial resiliency. For a quick DEAI refresher, before we get into how to apply that lens towards redoing the budget, we first want to take a look at diversity. So diversity at the museum means the intentional seeking to support both diverse staff and audiences. So it's back end and front end of museums, or internal or external, however you like to look at it. And we do that through diverse hiring practices, which means we also need to make sure we're offering ethical and competitive wages and diversifying the collection and program offerings. So there's a few different ways where the budget needs to be invested in order to help support the concept and priority of diversity at the museum. E is for equity, and equity at the museum is offering a multitude of ways that people can access collections and museum programming, multiple different ways that are comfortable for them and how they want to engage with you and your collections. Accessibility at the museum means supporting multiple avenues and parity of experience, and that is for staff and for our audiences. So again, it's that external and internal. How are we building in accessibility into our museum programming, but also how are we building in accessibility to the way we do business? And where the budget is allocated to support those things will indicate our prioritization of them. Next, I for inclusion. Inclusion at the museum is the effort to mitigate harm and promote a sense of belonging for non-dominant culture communities. So any of the cultures that may have been marginalized, mistreated, previously underinvited into our museum spaces, into the collection. Where are we investing where we can build more inclusive programming, we can build more inclusive collections, and ultimately build a more inclusive environment. So now that we have the values for DEAI and some examples for how those should be showing up in our budget, there are two ways we can go about applying this lens or this filter. First, we need to review and ask how line items support one or more of the DEAI value areas. So as we're looking at the budget as it's presented, can we identify at a minimum at least one of our DEAI values to that budget line? Then starting with a clean slate. So for our second option, instead of doing here's my budget, let's apply DEAI. This is the reverse of it. Some people, their brains need like a clean slate. How would we create a budget with DEAI in mind, what are the items that need to go on the budget first that meet one or more of the DEAI areas? And then how would we assign and balance the funding based on those areas? So taking a look and making sure that there's the appropriate allocation to meet the need for each of those areas. So here's an example. A museum states that they value DEAI and they hope to improve their work in this area, so as a program initiative. Specifically, representation facilitated by curator fellowships and more ethical labor practices. So this one is focusing on how can we bring more people into the actual staff of the museum, so the more internal area. How can we invest in that? And it needs to look like perhaps paid fellowships and increasing better ethical labor practices, better ethical wages. In order to meaningfully support this value, an increase in the staffing budget is needed. So if you're going to provide those ethical labor opportunities, if you're going to provide those competitive fiscally fellowships, you need to have the budget to meet what those numbers should be. And then a marker for success would be, okay, we got those budget allocations, they were correct and appropriate in their portion, and we were able to add new staff positions. We were able to offer salaries that meet market rate and account for an annual cost of living and merit increases. And we have paid internships. So we have a few different areas where we've offered ethical labor for people to come and join the museum without having to be from a privileged place or having to sacrifice in an unethical way. Now, information to gather and inform the budget. Now that we've got some of the tools and strategies, what is it that you actually need to move forward? We need the mission statement, of course, the strategic plan, and both of those should hopefully be easy to find, especially if you're a nonprofit museum. Those should usually always be published on your website. You need a sample of the past budget, so getting your hands on a budget that's been in the last 1 or 2 years. And if you're taking a look at slush fund allocation, if that exists at your museum, getting a sample of what the past allocations were, where they went to, and for how much. Getting a sense of where the fundraising efforts have been, where have the development staff spent time in terms of donor cultivation or grant application, and where those priority areas are. And then what can be very helpful is budgets of peer museums. So seeing how other museums are allocating their funding can provide some insight in terms of where your museum is already doing well and it's healthy in its sense of budget allocation, and where perhaps is your museum able to take a lesson or very, very favorably copy one of our peer museums and what they are doing well. So getting a sense and outside perspective can also be very informative. And then the meaning behind the data. So the mission statement and strategic plan, there's the obvious meaning. It's a little, it's very upfront and just not difficult at all to discern if the museum did a good job at its mission statement and strategic plan, and taking a look at those values and where that funding is. As you're taking a look at the sample of the past budget, getting a sense of where the funding went for these last couple of years and whether or not that's meeting your evaluation expectations for where the funding should be going. And the same is true when we're taking a look at anything like a slush fund or past fundraising efforts. Where are areas being funded but inconsistently? For example, we don't always have the budget to fund every area that we prioritize, but are there areas that are consistently being low enough on the priority list that they're having to rely on the inconsistent funding of like a slush fund allocation? And does that make sense given some of the other things that are being prioritized for the annual budget? And then the budgets of the peer museums, having that as an evaluative comparison can be incredibly helpful for you to derive meaning from what you're seeing at your museum and how that is playing out similarly or differently at a peer museum. So how to create your museum budget. And again, this is Whether or not you're actually in charge of the budget, going through this process can be incredibly helpful and informative for you and how you ask for resources, as well as giving you an opportunity to do some advocacy for improvements of how the museum does business. So first, list all of your values, or all of the museum's values really, as stated by the museum. What is the museum actively saying through its mission statement, through the strategic plan, what it values? For each of those values, list the departments, programs, and projects that fall under each of those values. And there may be some that meet a couple different values. That's okay. This is more an exercise of everything that is getting currently funded. How is it meeting up against what the museum says it values? Next, list how much money was received by each department, program, and project in the past. So we've married these up against the values, but what are the actual dollar amounts being allocated to these value areas? This will give you a real sense of, okay, for value 1 and 2, we're funding it 100%, no issue. However, value 3 and 4, it's maybe gets slush funding and that's it. And there's a real unbalance in terms of what each of the values are being funded at. And did the allocation meet the need? So for many of us, we have several different priorities, values that we're trying to meet. Are they being met with a sufficient amount of money? If not, does a rebalancing need to occur? And if a rebalancing is not possible or there's still not enough money, what different decisions need to be made in order to bring it into balance? To continue, which of these value areas appear to be repeatedly underfunded unless external funding or slush funding is received? So with that value 3 and 4 example, they're always relying on these inconsistent and often last minute funds. Is there a pattern here? How does your peer museum allocation compare to your home institution? So once you've done the homework and writing out how your museum budget is looking, how does your peer institution look? How would you adjust the allocations based on the stated museum values and the available funds? So if we're seeing a real gap or disparity, what sort of rebalancing or reallocation of funds would we recommend? And which departments, programs, or projects are left unfunded or underfunded and chronically? Which are optional and can be paused until more funding is received? So this isn't an acknowledgement of sometimes we just don't have the money to fund all of our values in a way where they should be have that funding allocation. And in which case we need to make a decision of we can't do 75% for all of them because that's going to mean the museum is not doing its job well. That means we need to reprioritize and reallocate. Now, steps to how to influence the museum budget. So you have gone through all of the work. You've done your research, you've done your evaluation piece, you've applied your DEAI lens to your budget, and now you have all of this information in terms of how resources are currently being allocated and how you would recommend they may be rebalanced or allocated differently. So you've gathered the information. Step 1, you've created your summary of data, create some questions. As you went through that last part, what were some of your suggestions for rebalancing the budget? Capturing all of those so that when you do get some FaceTime with somebody, you have your questions and suggestions ready to go. Step 3, meeting with someone who has access and direct influence to the budget. So you may not be the person in the room who gets to make decisions or talk about the budget, but chances are you know other staff members who are in the room, or at least have that direct influence factor. So meeting with one or more of them to talk through your budget analysis and getting insight, which will be helpful for you, but hopefully also imparting wisdom and insight from yourself to those people that you talk to. And then step 4, continuing data gathering and advocacy. So as each year progresses, as you see different budget allocations occurring, updating your information to track where improvements have been made and where perhaps there's still opportunity for us to do better. So in conclusion, we've talked about how a museum communicates what it values. We've taken a look at museum budget areas to evaluate. We walked through how to apply a DEAI lens to the museum budget. We went through information to gather and inform the museum budget and an exercise of you creating the budget, what that can look like. And then how you can influence the museum budget. So taking everything that you've learned and all of the thinking that you've done and the visioning and doing some indirect influence of your own of the museum budget. And before we leave you, a quick plug for the most recent collaboration I've done with Lucidea, Prepare for Takeoff, Get Your Museum Digital Project Off the Ground, is now available. There's free e-copies courtesy of Lucidea Press, so please go pick one up if you haven't already. And with that, I will turn it back over to Bradley.
Thank you, Rachel, for the wonderful presentation. And if you'd like to learn more about our museum collections management system called Argus, please feel free to visit our website or reach out to us at sales@lucidea.com, and we would be happy to have a chat with you. And if you have any more questions on any of our software or our company, our contact details are listed on the screen. Please stay tuned for more webinars and content related to this series in the future. And on behalf of the Lucidea team, I thank you all for attending. Thanks.